Okay, welcome back. And now is the second part, and we call it Acting for Social Progress. And I will give you the floor again to present a vision on how social progress can be promoted by searching a new third way, by reforming capitalism and mobilizing change makers.
Thank you very much. Yes, so solutions, so that you've already seen. Now I'll talk about the second part of the book, and I'll talk a little bit about this idea of a third way, and then we'll look at reforming capitalism, the welfare state, the politics system, and then how everyone can do something about it. The first thing is there are some old ideas that are around, and one of these ideas that we have to fight is that it's all about property. And that comes from the socialist tradition, which really focuses on property. So we have our manifesto, right? And the title is a bit inspired by some recent talk about another old manifesto that was published in 1848, which had a list of reforms. You had a list of 10 reforms. I mean, perhaps it's too small for you to read, but I've put in red the points that are about confiscating property, abolishing property, and all that. So all that was wrong-headed, right? We should not focus that much on property, and we should focus on something that is a bit more sophisticated. And so looking for a third way, right? So capitalism, socialism, and what about a third way? There have been three sorts of, in tradition, three sorts of ideas. So one is using the welfare state for redistributing income after the market. The second idea is using the welfare state for preparing people for the market. That is sometimes called pre-distribution. And Giddens and Tony Blair, who was inspired by Giddens, have been pushing this idea. And there is one which is less famous, less popular, but that we want to highlight is this idea that we should really tweak the system, including the productive firms, so transform them into real associations. That goes back to John Stuart Mill and the Nobel Prize James Mead. And really this is about looking not just at power, but also at, not just at resources, but also at the distribution of power and status and the quality of social relations. So we already heard about the fact that there are things happening on the health front which are not good, like a rise of these despair deaths in the US. So Denny has explained that. And there is also in Europe statistics showing that for many workers in different professions, the demands on their job have increased at the same time as their autonomy has decreased. And that is triggering a phenomenon called as job strain, which can have health consequences, and in particular mental health consequences. So perhaps people sometimes say, at least if you ask about the poor people, for them resources are the most important thing. That's not even true. If you really ask poor people, the poorest people, they tell you the most important thing is not that we lack resources, it's that we are hated by the rest of society. We are attacked, we are oppressed, we are shamed by the rest of society. And this is a quote that comes from an association, ATD, that has been collecting voices of the poor in this way. And we highlight many experiments that have taken place, for instance, in India, where you have a lot of empowerment efforts done by associations like the Self-Employed Women Association. If you want to look at what we can do to promote social progress, essentially you can summarize in terms of three ideas. So you can prepare people for competition, that's the Giddens-Blair idea of the third way. Or you can just rescue the losers, right? That's the sort of the first version of the third way. Or you can change the rules of the game. And changing the rules of the game is a bit more ambitious. And this is what socialism wants to do by abolishing private property. Wrong idea. And this is what the third way is trying to do. And this is perhaps more interesting. Competition, cooperation, that's an interesting issue. Actually, they are not quite in opposition. We need to find the right combination. And perhaps in the discussion we can talk a little bit about that. Okay, reforming capitalism. We heard already very interesting description of the chapter that is key in the big report on this issue by Kerstin. So I'll go quick on this. So there is this issue of we have to change at the same time the purpose and the governance of the corporation. So the corporation is not owned, it's not the ownership of the shareholders. That's a mistake. I mean, the legal specialists tell you that's just wrong, it's not true. But more broadly, we have to realize that the corporation should be attending to the interest of all stakeholders within the firm, but also around it. and that implies changing the governance and changing its purpose. We have also a problem with corporations, not just that the way they function themselves, but the way they try to influence politics. And that has become a real issue in many countries. You have now several countries where the main source of political funding comes from corporations. And corporations have become very big with globalization. And there has been a big trend in market concentration that economists are now able to describe. So this is something that's very recent. It used to be difficult to measure that, but now it's really something that is consensual. There has been a big movement of concentration. And firms have been using, the big firms have been using their influence in many ways, lobbying. So corporate philanthropy is very nice, but the problem is not democratic, right? So you have big, very wealthy donors who have their ideas, so they will push their causes, but there is no collective discussion about whether these causes are the most important ones. And of course, they also do things which are like funding think tanks that will promote their particular agenda. And all of this has undermined the trust in institutions. So people realize that all this is happening, even if they don't have a clear view of it, because a lot of that is hidden, but still they think that the government is more or less captured by big interest, and they are partly right, and perhaps mostly right. Another trend is the commodification of many things that has changed our society, and we need to really try to curb these trends by restoring competition, by discussing, having a democratic deliberation about the moral limits of markets, what should not be commodified, and we have also to look at the education of business leaders, something that can really make them more attuned to general social concerns. And finally, we have to think of the regulation of finance. I will not say much more about that, given the limited time. Now, we've already talked about the emancipatory or the emancipating state. And so the welfare state is under pressure. And it's true that we have concerns about globalization and all that, but nevertheless, it's a bit overblown. There are still a lot of things that national governments can do, and the proof of that is that there are still a lot of things that they do. You have a diversity of policies, and so these arrows here describe the reduction of inequality that is done by various policies, tax and transfer policies in various countries. So some countries do a lot, and some countries do very little. So there is a big variety. It's not as if everybody was doing the same thing. And if you look at the increase in public social expenditures, this shows that there is not exactly a race to the bottom. If there were a true race to the bottom, this should decrease. It's not decreasing. It's true, nevertheless, that there is some pressure coming from the fact that mobile factors, thanks to globalization, can really escape taxes. So capital and the most skilled people can really travel easily and escape taxes. So that puts pressure of states have to shift taxes toward the more immobile tax bases. Debt has been increasing, so that is a serious issue. And we have the demographic problem of imbalance, aging in some countries and a youth bulge in developing countries. And we have pressure coming from the health system, more dependent people living in old age. And we have the problem of the acceleration of technical change, which makes people's careers jump from one job to another, and we have to retrain them, we have to help them during the transition. That's a new cost that didn't exist when people had their whole career in the same firm, in the same job. By the way, one little remark that is perhaps not always known is that, in fact, most states are very similar when you compute the social spending that combines the public social spending and the compulsory private spending. So everybody must have a health insurance unless they are really destitute, but or they must prepare for their pension. So for instance, the US, which is famously known as having a low welfare state in public terms, when you add the compulsory private expenses, it's actually one of the most, the country with the highest share in spending, very close to France. Sweden is not the top here, actually. Sweden appears here. And one thing that is fascinating is the fact that now welfare policies are not only for the developed countries, because you have a lot of emerging countries which have reached, so this is Sweden in 1920, and Sweden in 1950. So most of the emerging economies are now above the level when Sweden introduced its pension system or its advanced health system. And so that's something that should encourage them to improve, to set up good welfare system. And they do that. They are really start. We see a lot of coverage for pension in many countries now. And health is also something that is lagging behind, but is coming up. So we have to rethink the welfare state to make it attuned to the 21st century. And you have these various forms of welfare state, as Esping Andersen famously has distinguished. You have the corporatist, the social democratic, and the liberal. So you have the Scandinavian countries here, which are very good at reducing inequalities and reducing the transmission of inequalities across generations. So they are the most mobile societies and the least unequal. And at the opposite, you have countries where you have a lot of immobility and a lot of inequalities. And so what should we imagine in this state? So all these types of states are doing various forms of policies. I discussed redistribution and predistribution, but you have two forms of predistribution. One is acting before the market, so preparing people with human capital, also inheritance policies. But you can also do predistribution in the market. You can tweak the way the market works or the way corporations work. So you can regulate contracts, you can have a policy regulating competition, and you can have regulation of prices and wages. So all types of welfare state combine these various things. The question is, what is the right mix of these various policies? And here is the idea of this emancipatory state. Can we move from the welfare state, the one that protects your welfare, to someone that puts you back on your feet, that puts you back in the driver's seat of your life, right? That's the question, this idea of the emancipating state. And so, in fact, we don't want to be dogmatic, and there are two formulas that can work. One is the one that in Sweden is well known. That's the social democratic formula, which has a lot of good sense. And I would call it the centralized formula, because it does the following. You have this centralized bargaining between the social partners, and you have a lot of wage compression coming out of that. But you have a discipline from the market economy. You have a cooperative ethos between the social partners, and you have a lot of investment in human capital and a universal safety net and public services. And you have this principle of protecting people, not their jobs, right? Which is quite important. There is a limitation, if I may say, respectfully, in this country, with this system, which is that this is somehow a grand bargain between capital and labor, rather than really moving forward to a deep form of social progress. And that's why the other form is perhaps something to explore, which is decentralized, and in which what you want to do is really to democratize every workplace. So it's not this grand bargain between representatives of the unions and representatives of the employers. Every firm should have democratic decision-making. And you have also to take account of the inequalities between firms, and that can be done partly by minimum wage policies. But the rest, I mean, this is essentially the same list as before. And so the key thing is transforming the centralized bargaining into something that happens at the level that transforms every corporation, transform the life of everyone. And so that's something that can really change society in a deeper way. Whether this is still capitalism or not, I would like to leave it open. I would tend to consider that this is no longer really capitalism, because it transforms the power relation between people. But you can still call it capitalism, because it's still very much a market economy, right? We keep the market discipline as an important feature here. But we need to have, so corporate social responsibility is very important, and bring some of that. And there is a movement among business leaders really pushing for a better organization, better governance in their firms. So that's pushing in that direction. It's very good, but it will not scale up, it will not generalize without government regulation, right? So that's something that must be recognized. Okay, perhaps I'll shift, I'll go quickly on this. There are issues that are interesting about how to deal with automation and how to deal with the gig economy, which is an interesting challenge. Perhaps we can come back on that later on. Let me say a few words about politics, if I have the time. Yeah. So the political system is something that can also be improved. You know, there is a close connection, mutual relation between a healthy society and a healthy political system. If you have deep inequalities, people don't trust one another, the social groups are fragmented, and they won't support solidarity mechanisms between them and so on. And so you need really to have a healthy system on both sides. And the difficulty is that democracy is really a public good. So if you don't protect it, if you don't put safeguards like constitutions and things like that, then it doesn't survive. So we could imagine just opening up the democratic rights on the market. So you could have a voting system where people could buy and sell their votes, right? That would kill democracy immediately, right? And this is what's not happening in the political system, frankly, even though a lot of lobbying and corruption is doing a little bit of that. But nevertheless, we don't have that. But somehow we have that in a way, in a big way on the labor market, where people accept to become employees in a subordinated position, relinquishing their right to have some autonomy in their work, right? And so the fact that people seem to support democracy less and less is perhaps due to the fact that democracy has become a little bit like an empty shell that is not really delivering concretely in their life in a very strong way. So that shows how the young generations now are less interested in democracy, even though we've done a survey that shows that actually in the US, that's only for the US, but there is quite a good level of support for a participatory conception of democracy. That's up there. Where it's about everyone participating in the decisions. And there is quite very low opposition to having a democratic government, fortunately, and also to having democratic companies, right? So there is something interesting here. But there is a strong concern about the fact that ordinary citizens don't have enough power. So people would like to have a democratic system where citizens have more power. So we should think of getting money out of politics. This is impossible. Politics needs money, so we cannot put money out of it. We have to regulate, to think of it in a better way. And so again, we should consider political funding as a public good and coordinate the contributions that people make to it and have watchdog organizations, institutions, either public or civil society or both, that really monitor that. There is this issue of whether the direct democracy is a sort of populist illusion, a danger. We need to have a little bit of direct democracy and a little bit of representative democracy. It's not as if each of them is perfect on its own. If you only entrust the elite, that will not go well. And there's a famous study by Larry Bartels showing that the wealthy in the US, they have preferences which are quite different from the rest of the population. So we need to really take account of the need to have a good quality of deliberation in our democratic system. Similarly for the media is really an important part of the political system, and we have to recognize that and treat the media system, including the social media system, also as a common good, something that needs watchdog institutions to monitor how it's financed, how it's governed, and the quality of its content as well, right? So this is something that's becoming very, very important, and now people understand the consequences of leaving it to just the market or to authoritarian states, right? So you have problems on both sides. Another thing that we talk more in the small book than in the report is changing the electoral rules. So there is research on voting rules that shows that certain voting rules enhance polarization, they encourage polarization, and other voting rules can encourage centrist candidates and push for more consensual ideas. So we should take that into consideration. There is the abstention problem. I come from the US, where abstention is really terrible. There is a very easy solution: make voting compulsory, as done in one country over 5 in the world. And one question that is tricky is the idea of having a global democracy. The report is very cautious about that, saying we should not really nurture a cosmopolitan dream, because that's not realistic and it's not going to happen. So I won't say much more about that. Perhaps we can come back in the discussion about it, but it's something that is not in the cards, as the report says. And finally, we have a last chapter, if I have 1 minute, that says that everybody can do something. And really, we need bottom-up initiatives, because you know what happens, the social changes, the structural changes are not really triggered by policymakers. The policymakers are surfers. They surf the waves of society, and when they see that it's going in one direction, they go in that direction, and so on. So they can help, they can crystallize things, they can institutionalize things, but they don't really impulse the big change, the long-term change. So that comes from society, and that's why we need things. So if you look, for instance, at the Me Too movement, that's part of a broader movement, but it's not a top-down movement, it's really a bottom-up movement. One popular motto is think global, act local. Now it's no longer the case. We need to act global as well, and it's very important to push for international civil society, so organizations that connect in networks, and that exists, and we give some examples. It can really amplify their power. And finally, this is my last slide. We propose ideas for everybody. Every reader of this small book can change things in their life, and that contributes to changing things in society. So you can change things in your family, especially if you are a man. There is a lot of work to do for men to improve the situation in families. You can change things in your work. As an employee, you can try to push for better governance. If you cannot change jobs, go to a better firm. If you are an employer, if you start a company, you can do a lot. I mean, you can do a lot of good, and many business leaders are really doing a lot of good now in that direction. If you are a consumer, an investor, a saver, you can really look at ethical consequences and try to use the information you have about the products. You can help your neighborhood by being a participant in various activities. And now, this is something we wrote we would not have written a few years ago. Just staying informed is now part of your civic duty, right? Try to avoid fake news and rumors and so on, conspiracy theories. That becomes part of a duty that is important. And being participating in the activities of citizens, the political system, getting involved, not necessarily as a politician, but really making sure that the democratic system is working, that people are not apathetic, is something that is part of what you can do in your everyday life. Okay, this is very quick. I'm a bit sorry that I don't give many details, but you can find the details in and more concrete ideas in these books. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marc. And now we are going to discuss how can this research be used in order to avoid human failure. And so we have some representatives from different sectors, and I would like to come up here on stage. It's Kristina Persson, who is the founder of the think tank Global Challenges and former Minister for Strategic Development and Nordic Cooperation. Take a seat, it's free seating. And Bettina Kashefi, who is the Chief Economist at Svensk Näringsliv. And Carlos Rojas, who is Chief Analyst at Sweden Research and Public, and also a public speaker on the topic of social sustainability and migration. And Robert Watt, who is Communication Director of Stockholm Environment Institute. And I will have a share myself. And I thought that I would, I have given a task to all of the people here on the panel to talk a little bit on how can this research be used, or what are your views on this research when it comes to your sector where you are present in now? And I think most of you have been in different sectors, so there is no waterproof walls in between them. But perhaps first, if you, I mean, you've been here during the day, if you just have a short comment or what you have heard so far. Carlos?
Short comment. Well, I think it has a big coverage. It covers many aspects that I think are very relevant, simply.
Robert?
I think my short comment is actually about something that's been raised already today, which is the relationship between this report and the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees. And one thing that still strikes me as an elephant in the room is the urgency with which we need to address climate change, whether or not it's 1.5 or 2 degrees that we want to stay underneath. And that this report is a good complement to the IPCC report.
Or a method.
Potentially a method, absolutely. But that it would be good to talk about how quickly you could achieve some of these things. And I perhaps we'll come into that.
Yeah, I'm very fond of this book. And I think it's necessary to discuss new means of making change possible and happen. Because we have been trying quite a long time now to push politicians, governments, to change their thinking and their action. And time is running out. Climate is obvious, but there are other threats to us, to our democracy. And if we don't act now, it may be too late one day. And I think this book provides us both with a good analysis, description of the problems and analysis, but also discussion of how to go forward. And in a new way, for us in Sweden, we have a rather centralist tradition, but this provides us with a different way of thinking that I think is worthwhile, have a serious talk about. And how do we mobilize from bottom up and mobilize the change makers, and how do we do this in collaboration with people in other parts of the world? And this, of course, is part of what we need for the climate as well.
Bettina, a short comment?
Yeah, I wasn't unfortunately here before listening to the presentations, but of course it's an interesting book with interesting ideas. Some of them I do not agree on. On the other hand, Marc lifts up some issues that are very important, that helps me being very proud of Sweden. For example, the income distribution before and after tax, and we can be proud of our country. But nowadays we aren't a country, we live in a globalized world, and I think that it is very important, and it is about time start to discuss these issues. And of course, I was thrilled reading Amartya Sen's foreword. He was our guru when I was a civil servant at the Ministry of Finance, talking about what you also said, Marc, the importance of the individual's capabilities and the issue of social mobility. That was important and made me happy to read.
Marc, in the book, in many chapters, it also talks a lot about change makers. There has to be a movement. And when you say you're proud of Sweden, and Kristina, you have been in politics too, we have seen labor movement, women's movement, green movement, citizens movement. And if we should start with you, Carlos, is there now a time for a social movement?
I think there's been a social movement. It is all the time. But of course, something is arising. And I think also that the civil society and the social movements, they're picking up on this desire that Marc also lifts, that for having cooperations, for having solidarity, for coexisting, for coping with problems in a concrete way. I think, I think the social movement is developing, and that it also has some issues that have to be coped with.
And if you would describe how would civil society use this research, or do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I think if someone is using it already, I think it's civil society, actually. I think, I was thinking when I saw the presentation that one very specific issue that's also common to everyone that intertwines several of these aspects is the reception of refugees that we have had and that we're going to have. That is one of those issues where many of these things could be applicable. And what I was thinking was that if we're beginning in this end, if I was telling you in this room now that there's a conflict nearby the borders of Europe, and during the next year, there's going to come people to Sweden. And we are a society in here, and most probably is that in this group, we will receive people knocking on these doors during the next year. Sometime during the year, 2 or 3 people at different times will come knock on the door and ask for refuge, for shelter and help coming from this country. Would you think that that would be something that we could cope with? Is it a feasible amount of people to help during a year, 2 or 3 people knocking on that door? Yes or no? Yes.
Of course.
Yes, of course, there's someone here. And I take this example because that is the amount of people that came to Sweden during 2015, when we had this top of refugee reception. And I mean, it was more people than ever before, but it was a 1.6% of the population, 1 in 60 more or less. And yes, roughly it would be 2-3 people coming here during a year, not at once even. And the fact is that Sweden coped with that, and very much because of civil society. And I take this example for really 2 reasons, because one reason is that there are many things that are feasible, but that are not done, or that are hindered to be done because of other powers, often power. The reason that we didn't get this explanation was that one of the failures of the refugee reception was bad planning from the central government, and you wouldn't have our prime minister standing there saying, oops, my mistake, I didn't plan for this, that was very a full possibility of happening. But he says, we have reached the limit, we can't receive people, and people adhere to that because he's leading us. And this is important because it's a part that we haven't discussed here, that it's also how do we communicate? We have a sense of urgency, it's very clear, but we also have a feasible opportunity of actually challenging the challenges and coping with them and getting forward. And I think that's very important to have in mind, that we have those possibilities, and the civil society do what they do because they feel it in their bodies. They see reality in a way that people on central level don't. And they see, we can do this. When people are coming to our municipality, even though the papers write that it's a huge amount and we can't cope with this, they say, yeah, we can. We see that we can, and we do it. And they walk the talk, and that's very important.
And if we go to the political field, Kristina, in what way can this research be used?
Well, first of all, it creates a lot of understanding of how things go together. It has a holistic view, and it's very constructive in the discussion of how to go about it. I mean, it's clearly value-based. The 3 values of equality, respect, and sustainability, they must go hand in hand. So it's an academic work that goes beyond what we are used to get from the academics. And it goes, I'm sorry to say, also beyond what politicians do. Because we live in a time when we need visions, and we need long-term thinking and strategies, and we need to have a systemic view on society, and we're not getting it. We have a system which is taking care of its old gains, the production of an old time, and keeping and caring for the old system instead of changing what needs to be changed. I mean, to transform the society into a fossil-free society in 20 years' time, or even less. I mean, that is a big transformation, and we're not talking about it. In this election period, we didn't have a discussion about it, and we don't see the beginning of this big change. We need to go from slight increase in CO2 emissions into -7% or even 8% per year, even in this year, because in this country, because from the consumption side, we are among the big sinners as well. And so, I mean, this is, of course, the civil society is extremely important, but it's important both for taking action themselves, as we did. I was traveling around the country, and they said, system collapse. We haven't heard about it, we haven't seen it. It works fine. Even in those areas of the country where we received a lot of people, it worked fine. It was in Skåne, in Malmö, they had problems. So they do a lot, but what they can do even more is to tell the politicians, the parties, and change the parties, reform the parties, create new movements, and work from bottom up to change the political situation and the systems and the society needs to reform to respond to the new challenges that we are living with. So it's a push from underneath and the action at the same time, because people and civil society in general cannot legislate, cannot create global new rules for the financial markets, cannot coordinate taxes around the world. I mean, there's a lot of very important, heavy decisions to be taken that needs to be taken by democratically elected governments. They need to cooperate. They're not even cooperating inside Europe today, or we have at least some problems. And we need to go much further than we are doing. And we need a push from people to do this. And so I think this book should be an issue, a basis for discussions. I would like to discuss this book with people in the trade union movement, in the popular movements like popular education, folkbildningen, it's informative. It's good. It's good reading to learn how society works and what the problems are and what we could do about it as well.
Are you thinking of starting a new party?
No. If I was 43, maybe.
43.
But when I was young, in the 70s, for instance, the trade union movement was very important in former enlightenment, global issues, international cooperation, solidarity. We had courses, we had a lot of education. They don't have anything any longer. They should go back to that. And if they would like to have me as a lecturer, I will happy to come.
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons why the parties are not doing that is because they want to win election. And they are not stupid, and they cannot go against the narrative that says something else.
But they are wrong. I mean, they're underestimating people. They're listening to the voters of the Sweden Democrats. And they are not representative for the people in general. And not even some of the Sweden Democrats really have read the party program or are really xenophobics. And so I think it's an empty room, space, an open window for those parties that would really like to discuss the long-term issues and be serious about politics. There's lots of people who didn't know what to vote this year, and even the last election was the same thing. They didn't find a party that reflected their own convictions. So I think change is waiting for the politicians to really be executed.
Are you also interested in the idea of having a more emancipating state? Because you also come from a party where it's been capital against labor. And there was a tryout of egenmakt in the 90s, and it was not really...
Yeah, that was a mistake, I think. That discussion that was won by the centralists was I'm sorry for that. But there were other efforts in the 70s, for instance, for wage earners owned companies, löntagarägda företag. But then we had this debate about the wage earning funds, which killed the discussion of economic democracy and made it not possible to raise again. Global Utmaning, think tank that I founded, have just published a book about this, and it shows that Sweden is far lagging behind other countries in the world when it comes to participatory ownership, democratic ownership, cooperatives and wage earning companies. So.
We move over to the cooperative, or the companies. And Bettina, Kashefi, you have read some of the manifest. How could it be used in the business
Well,
sector?
for sure it will be used and thought about in many ways. I'm just looking at a slide here now, but about what you can do as an individual. You can bring change to your work or through your work. I think work can bring change to an individual also. But I'll come to that. Let me once again reflect upon my big favorite on earth, the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen. He also says in his foreword that too much time has been spent on discussing the pros and cons of the market economy, and he also thinks that focus should be put on reforming institutions. For example, to make politicians have the possibility to handle the situation we had during 2015 when we had this influx of refugees, for example. So reform institutions and behaviors and so forth, he says. And I do really agree, because I worked at the central government for sort of 100 years, and we always had this ongoing discussion about how should we change the institutions, the rules and regulation as to foster the possibility to create a sustainable state and welfare state and all that. And it is equally important today, I must say, and the role of the public commitment, the offentliga sektorns role as of today is so important. And what is the role in the market economy? And for example, we should discuss the rule of law, and I was very happy that you said that ownership and property ownership, that is nothing we are going to discuss today. We've tried it, we failed, and I'm happy to hear that. But what we need to do is we need to discuss the sort of public finance, tax and transfer model. How can we create them as to make them driving people's incentives for work, while at the same time decrease poverty and negative, not önskade income distributions. So it's very important to discuss that. And in particular in these days when we have globalization, we have populism, tensions all over the world, and protectionism. You know what? Protectionism is something that I feel in my whole body every day. I'm half Iranian. My father lives in Iran. A few days ago, I read in the paper that Volvo and Saab, they are getting out of Iran because they are not allowed to be there. They are too scared of the EU due to Donald Trump. And that is really scary, because I see how people suffer from not being able to trade. It makes me seriously sad. Therefore, I was very happy hearing that Paul Romer and Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize now. A combination of technical innovation and environmental issues and the development of the population on the earth. So that makes me very, very, very happy. But then I'm going to talk about the role of the business. Of course, it's fundamental. Look upon Sweden. Almost half GDP is from trade, foreign trade. That's where the resources come from. No companies, no welfare. No welfare, no new companies. And it is very important to understand the interaction between the private companies that hire entrepreneurship, that build companies, that hire people, deliver taxes to the public sector, which means that we can have educated people, we can have healthcare and elderly care, on the one hand. On the other hand, without education, elderly care and so forth, the companies will not survive. And I think it is a very important understanding to see that link. Sometimes it's like a conflict between them both. But I think they are like in a marriage. One cannot survive without the other if it's a good marriage. And I think it is.
The marriage is in the book also described that companies they are too undemocratic. They have too little of responsibility. They are in judicial identity that can do things that persons can't do. And they are going too far. They have less responsibility. I just wanted to see if you agree as much as you hope you do. So you raise your hand, Marc.
Objection.
Well, Marc, I think it's a fantastic piece of work, but it doesn't mean that I think you should rewrite a few pages.
Marc,
so on that
actually,
point, I don't agree.
you have a microphone. Yeah. You wanted to comment. I asked for your hand.
No, it was just I wanted to correct what I said. Is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's on.
I just wanted to correct what I said about ownership, because I don't want to give the impression that everything is okay about the distribution of wealth, and the concentration of wealth is indeed a problem. So we need to do something about it, and in particular think about the transmission of wealth and inheritance rules. It's very important to fight for equality of opportunity, which means that we should really make sure that the generations are not transmitting the concentrated wealth to the hands of the next generation. So that's a very important thing. I hope we can agree on that.
We can agree, certainly. You showed on your graph that we are in the bottom when it comes to the Gini coefficient and also on the generational aspect. And I think that is very important to allow for vad heter det nu? Social mobility was the word I was after. So yes, we agree.
Okay, I'll try again.
Yeah.
Robert Watt, how can this research be used in, you're both from the environmental sector but also as an academic?
I think that it's a challenge. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the academic side to begin with. So I think it's a challenge to research and universities, to academia. I mean, if you think about the role of science and research in social progress, it's sort of, you could characterize it having playing two roles. One is to do with knowledge generation. It's a knowledge generator. It's about creating ideas and innovations that both interpret the past and present, but also create a future. And I think one of the keys there is that we need to think about the way in which being a knowledge generator can also be about providing evidence for decision makers, whether that's policy makers or decision makers in industry and business. And there's currently a bit of a tension there, I think, where the sort of way in which research and universities are governed is that it's all about, can you put a price tag on that piece of research? It's also to do with funding, perhaps not so much in Sweden, but in other countries, particularly in Anglo-Saxon traditions, where funding for universities is now quite tied to how many students you can recruit. So the financial incentive becomes much more about, can you sell your university, can you sell your education? And actually there is a little bit of a less of a focus on what are those innovative new ideas. The second role, of course, is as an educator. It's not as though that is an absolutely crucial role, and it's an ingredient in social mobility. That's very important. That is something that needs to be improved in a sense. And it's about building social capital and to a certain extent building cohesion as well, because if we end up with a situation where there is segregation, those who go to university and those who don't, we've seen what the evidence says in terms of the health outcomes for those different people who've gone to university live longer. So we need to think about the role of universities and research as educators. I've sort of thought about this as, what does this mean? What actions could be taken? And I think there are three action areas. One is about co-creating knowledge. So this is about producing knowledge differently, doing science in a different way. And in Sweden, we talk a little bit about samverkan now, collaboration between the academy and, well, anyone outside the academy, essentially. There's a lot of focus on business and industry. And to give you one concrete example, my institute's been working together with the Swedish Association of Steel Producers to help to turn what for them is quite a sort of intangible, nebulous concept, which is mentioned in the report, the Sustainable Development Goals, and turn it into something that actually can help them guide their business strategy, guide their investments. Yeah. And I'd say that part of that process has then led to a collaboration to produce steel without burning coal. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be a technological innovation that rests on the collaboration between science and research, and science, not only the technological engineering science, but also social sciences and industry. So samverkan can really generate great benefits. I just mentioned very quickly that access is really important. Access in terms of access to knowledge. We need to get out of these paywalls, this prevention, these hurdles that make access to knowledge difficult for people. The second action area is about powering individual dignity. And I think that universities need to do a lot more to open up to the marginalized, and marginalized all over the world. There's a real trend among many universities, perhaps more the Anglo-Saxon universities, about opening filial institutes, university campuses in China or in Singapore. They're just chasing money. It's not actually about powering that individual dignity for people who are marginalized. And that's something that I think is a role that is not fully embraced by universities. We also need to think about ongoing education at a scale that's not been seen since the post-war period. And that's partly to do with creating a just transition for those people who are going to be put out of work by the transition to a non-fossil fuel economy. And it's also about the fact that there's a lot more movement in the workforce. People are changing jobs, they're having to retrain constantly, and the universities can play a role. And I want to bang the drum for something that Sweden does well and is not done so well elsewhere. Folkbildning. You mentioned it, Kristina. Folkuniversitetet. Fantastic. More of that.
Education.
And the last one is universities can help to build social infrastructure, to be a space where the relationship between society and science can be activated and can be energized, going beyond the science festival, which always just basically gets white middle class people to come along and actually engage in a radical way through perhaps citizen science about being part of a community. Those are my three ideas.
Yes, thank you very much. There are some hands here to comment on them. I can see some hands here, but I also see some hands here, and I'm eager to let you ask a question or two. But Carlos.
Yeah, just an anecdote regarding the paywalls. I guess you're talking about research journals and libraries, and also, of course, media. And I have a friend that he's pushing out good news, real good news, not fake news, to Sweden Democrats voters, because it's a correlation between if you're exposed to good news, your sympathy for the Sweden Democrats go down. But most good news are behind paywalls. All the fake news are free, but the good news are behind paywalls of the big magazines. So this can be a bigger issue than we think about. But what I was thinking was really that I think one thing that struck me when Rob was talking was that there's a common problem for all these institutions, the political, the academia, the media, of course, that is that we don't let the development of society prevail power. We're always looking for power in terms of money or other kinds of power before trying to apply the best solutions or the best proposals. I mean, if you see any political party, they're not proposing their biggest or boldest ideas. They're proposing what they're going to win the next elections with. And you can see that in civil society as well, that people are not really making a long-time plan of how am I going to change society for the rest of my life. They're looking at what can give me likes on Facebook, what organization is hyped right now that I can join. You're not really deciding, even though you think so, out of what's the rational best that I can do for my society, but you have a high degree of self-interest, whether you're a capitalist or an idealist. What capital is for a capitalist, for an idealist, the same is ideas or identity or ideals. And if I somehow have to challenge my ideals or my ideas or my identity, I might not do that in the same way that a capitalist might not challenge their possession of capital, if that is good for the common good. So I think that's an important thing to ground all the common development of society on, that we have to really analyze what are we doing and why? When are we doing research for money? You know, why should we do research for money? Why shouldn't we just do research, and if we get paid, we get paid, and otherwise I eat bread? I don't know. But, you know, there's a mindset, a mind shift going on there that I think is important.
Would you argue for citizen wage?
I think it's an old idea that you can surely develop better versions of the idea that's on the table. But of course, if you had some basic security that was a little bit higher than we have now in a welfare state like Sweden, I could get a better balance towards my company, for instance, without being in an oppressive position myself. I could maybe make choices more freely if I could just push a button and the next day I would get a basic income, even though that basic income wasn't forever. Then I could, push you or push my boss or push my financer and say, I really want to do this. I don't want to do this other thing that you want me to do for money. But I don't know if just exactly basic income is the solution, but it's an interesting thing to explore. How can we have that economic security that gives us power to oppose?
Well, the words innovation and structural change have been mentioned, and of course it's extremely important in a capitalist society and in a market economy. And we are still talking, whatever will happen in the future, we are talking about a market economy, maybe with a mixed change structure of ownership and influence within the corporations. But there is a weakness in this model in the book, and that is, if it is very democratic, it may change in a slower way than it otherwise would have done. The push for change will be weaker. And if you compete on a global market, that will definitely harm your efficiency and your capacity to grow and to provide people with good incomes and employment. So both innovation and the structure change has been the strength of the Swedish economy, and the Swedish business communities is good at this. We are good at this. And would it be more democratic? That could be the price that we would be paying. Maybe there is a trade-off here that could be discussed, but still, I think this is something that also should be discussed.
Yes.
Yes, so that's a good question. So indeed, I think it's actually possible to protect people and not jobs, even in the decentralized democratic system. You find things a bit like that in, for instance, we were talking about cooperatives. So you have the Mondragon system in the Basque Country, where they have actually a consortium of cooperatives, and so they have quite a lot of flexibility. Actually, if one cooperative is going badly, the workers are transferred to other cooperatives. So that works within the consortium. But so it's not as if democracy in firms implied a completely rigid form. Actually, I think it's the opposite. And when we just heard that perhaps democracy means a slower change, it depends a bit on the context. If you think of business companies, it's actually the opposite, because when people are really motivated and part of the decision, they are more flexible. Instead of opposing the thing because they believe that other people will decide for them against their interests, they are part of the thing and they are more willing to, for instance, decrease their wages during a difficult time or things like that. So it's actually sometimes easier when people are part of the decision to be adaptive, innovative, and quicker in reacting.
I think I saw, yes. Bettina, and then the microphone. Could we be there?
I
Bettina?
agree,
Yes.
that's a good point, and it's the microphone is not on, I think.
It works.
Is
Yeah,
it
it works.
on?
Yeah.
Do
Yes,
you
it
hear
is.
me?
It's-
I don't hear myself. Okay, it's very good that I mean, our centralized model, it's great because the trade unions and the employers are very much agree on protect people, not job. And there we have something further to develop, because we are not good at what you pointed out in the former discussion, the lifelong learning issue. It has been an ongoing discussion for 100 years, but nothing happens. Everything seems to fail. So that's there we have to speed up, I think. Another thing that the trade union now say, which I love as an idea, is that we hate. I mean, people can be scared of new technology, right? But they say we are not scared of the new technology. We're scared of the old technology, and that's something, and that is also a challenge, I think.
In men, yes. Your question first. Thank you very much. Can you first, Mark, because that comes back in the book many times, of democratization and of cooperatives. Can you describe what is it that you see when you talk about democratization of companies?
Yeah, so it may depend on the size of the company, right? So it can be quite informal when the company is small. but you can have big companies with a democratic system as well. So what I have in mind is something for large companies where you have a board of directors or something similar, where you have representatives of those who provide capital, those who provide labor, and the others. And I think it would be important, so instead of saying the power should go from the shareholders to the workers, that would be an excessive move. Actually, what we need to have is these two representatives of these two blocks are there, but we need a third block which represents the other stakeholders, like the customers, the providers of the firm, the suppliers, and the local communities in which the firm operates. And that would provide a third block. We could also have independent directors. That's another possibility, but I'm not too keen on it. And so we need to have a system in which none of these blocks has the majority by itself so that it can dictate it according to its own interests. That would be my favorite approach. And that means that it's not about changing the ownership structure of the firm. We can still have the equity system, and we can still have shareholders. That's fine. We can have banks and so on. So we don't really need to change the ownership structure, but we need to change the power structure.
I might be old-fashioned and hopefully not very stupid, and I've never said that I'm not open to different kind of ownerships. I look upon the issue, for example, on personaloptioner, employee option, or what is it called in English? That is one way of engaging the employees more, and that has been on top of the agenda for many of our member companies, not the least Spotify, for example. They were not quite satisfied with the proposal that came from the government. So anyway, they decided to expand in New York rather than in Sweden. But that was not the only reason. One main reason was because they couldn't find housing here. So they couldn't attract staff. So personaloptioner is one way to go, and also there is a very big discussion among our small and medium-sized enterprises. The average age among them is approximately 62 years or so, and they are so nervous what to do when they go into retirement, and they need help with getting their staff with something called ESOP, employer...
shared ownership plan.
Yes, and that is an ongoing discussion. And actually we are trying to do some... have a researcher to look into that issue, because that is a good idea. Because these people they love their companies, but they see, in particular in rural areas, it's very, very difficult to get financing and to get someone to take over the companies, and that is so sad. So I'm open to any suggestions.
Good to know. Robert.
Are we in a system collapse? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a bit of crystal ball gazing. And however, I think you can say that the combination of climate change and other pressures on ecosystems, as described by the planetary boundaries concept, would imply that we are nearing tipping points. We are nearing collapse in some systems, environmental and ecological systems. And I think that whether then there's a correlation with other political systems that might be put under pressure, I can't say. But they, in combination, I think it is a very dangerous situation. And this comes back to what I wanted to say about the urgency of the problem, which is that the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees gives us 10 or 12 years to make these sorts of transformations to all sectors of the economy. Every single sector will have to transform. And my concern, I suppose, is that the sorts of ideas here, which are ideas about what individuals can do, are great for people who have the agency to do this, and that is not everybody in the world. And that's a bit of a problem that China is like a really big economy. It's not a market economy that you describe. But it also places a huge amount of responsibility on individuals, where actually, and we do a lot of studies on, helping people to try and calculate their emissions, their personal emissions, giving them tips on what they could do to reduce those. And there's quite clear evidence of what you should do. Eat less meat. Don't fly. don't drive. I mean, it's not that difficult. But the system has inbuilt in it, and that's the economic system, but also infrastructure has inbuilt in it a level of emissions that actually an individual can't have an impact upon. And I think we need to really address that. That's why I see this as a complement about governance and institutions to things like the IPCC report and to the concept of planetary boundaries. But it's not enough, and it's possibly not quick enough. Implementing all of these things is not quick enough to deal with the decade that we've got left. So we have to also use the current setup while transforming it at the same time. That's a really big challenge.
And Robert, would you say that there is a need for another improved global governance? It was said here in the book that perhaps when it comes to climate change, but we also have threats like biological collapse or nuclear war. Are we in the need of another system that can manage common global catastrophic risks?
I think we need to defend what we've got, actually, just for the moment. It's under so much pressure from some political actors who want to undermine global institutions.
Right. My last question to you, Gustav and Mark. When making research, sometimes you have an idea and you want to prove it with research. Or you can face a problem and you can see how can we do it with research. Did some of this research change your mind or open your eyes for any of the things that is needed to be done? Mark, first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was an interdisciplinary endeavor. And, you know, people sometimes say, does it make sense to have multiple disciplines work together? I think it's necessary when we look at problems. When we start with real problems, we don't start from schools of thought or disciplines. We look at the problems, and then we need to bring the relevant competencies to look at this problem. And that's what we've tried to do here. And actually, perhaps we could have had more people from the hard sciences, and we're thinking of evolving in that direction, especially to deal with the environmental issues a bit better. But really, I think that's a way to learn. And I've learned a lot. I'm an economist. I was also trained a little bit as a philosopher. I've learned a lot about social sciences by this activity. And so I think everybody can learn by looking. It's a bit like a summary of where we are in the social sciences when they look at real problems of society.
I would like to thank the panel, and then I would like to give the last word to you, Gustav. How do you want to continue this work that you have been one of the initiative takers on?
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. I'm not sure that this microphone is on.
Now
it's on.
Yeah.
Well, we hope. We have this hope that we could continue like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that this is a first one, and then it should, of course, be out for discussion, criticism, and things like that, and that we succeed in updating it later, like you do with this. So maybe that in 5 years we could come back and perhaps we've updated some things, we've added some things from the kind of input we get from all different ways. Of course, and I would like again to thank those who funded this, because this is not usual research. It was kind of tricky to find organization we funded, and Riksbankens Jubileumsfond has been great for that. But we hope to be able to build something up that we can continue and come back again in perhaps 5 years.
Thank you very much, Gustav. Now I know that there is a mingle. I don't know what's offered. We'll see. And then there is a premiere of a film of a new society, and that starts at 5 o'clock. It's the first time it's viewed, and it's a 1.5 hour film. So thank you very much for participating, and not the least, thank you here in the panel.